Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. To get started and begin, I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, where I'm hosting this event from today, as well as the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and to elders past and present. This includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, asexual, and queer First Nations communities who we acknowledge, pay our respects to, show solidarity with, and celebrate, especially during World Pride, which is currently being held for the first time in the Southern Hemisphere on the lands of the Eora Nation in Sydney. Today, I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Lucas Larochelle, who is one of the most creatively and conceptually innovative people working at the intersection of queer art, design, technology, and history today. Lucas is a Canadian designer and researcher whose work investigates queer and transgender digital cultures, community-based archiving, and co-creative media. Their work on queering the map has attracted a truly global attention. They've given numerous lectures and workshops, including for Stanford University and the Guggenheim Museum. And today we're very lucky that they're joining us for this event hosted by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society on their artificially intelligent queer creation, QT.bot. QT.bot is a text and based on a text and image model that's trained on more than 82,000 posts from the queer community archive and the mapping platform Queering the Map, as well as scraped from Google Street View imagery that takes the tagged coordinates of Queering the Map posts. If you are not familiar with Queering the Map, it's amazing. It's a community-generated counter mapping platform on and with which visitors can archive their own queer experiences in relation to physical space. You can check this out and contribute your own stories to queeringthemap.com. So QT.bot is an amazing artistic elaboration of this digital archive. It's a creative query of data and engagement with neural networks that produces illusory memories, querying the standard logics of these kinds of technologies to amplify the potential for failure and the fantastic. It's a really innovative line of flight within Lucas's broader engagements with LGBTQ2A+ life. And this queer use of machine learning is a really rich illustration of the creative and affective possibilities of artificial intelligence technologies. Our conversation today is a part of the Artificial Intelligence series, which is a series of in-conversation talks about technology and fiction hosted by me, Dr. Ash Watson, and the ADM+S Centre. It probes the porous boundaries between machine realities and imagination and features leading scholars from the humanities, design fields and social sciences who are changing what and how we know about emerging technologies. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the session today, so please do feel free to write these in the chat as we go or save them for when I call for questions later. If there's any issues or problems with sound, please also just let me know in the chat. Hopefully we've been troubleshooting those already this morning. But let's dive straight in. Lucas, I've got a series of questions for you. We'll go back and forth on these for most of the hour, and then we'll open up to audience questions later on. And just to flag again for everybody that the session is being recorded today. So Lucas, we're talking about QT.bot today, but I think it's important for context and also to really understand, I think, the meaning and the roots of the QT.bot project for us to talk a bit about Queering the Map first. There's a really important relation between the two projects. And I know that you have, you've written about this in a number of formats, but I'd love for you to kick our discussion off today by just sharing this again. What are the roots of the Queering the Map project, and how did it come into being, both as an idea and in practice?
Absolutely. So Queering the Map emerged, I started the project in 2017, and it was following this bike ride that I took, that I would take to and from school every day. And I would pass by this tree in Parc Jean-Mance in Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, or Montreal. And it was the tree at which I had met someone that I would eventually fall in love with. And it's also the tree at which I first expressed my trans non-binary experience rather explosively. And so it was this site that held multiple overlapping scenes of queer and trans experience in relationship to place. And so as I continued this bike ride, I began to think about all the other places that were haunted by this kind of lingering queer and trans affect. And at the time I was reading, I had just, or was reading or had just read Sarah Ahmed's book, Queer Phenomenology, which thinks about gender, race, and sexuality as phenomenological orientations in the world. And I was really struck by this idea. And I was also reading Jose Esteban Munoz's book, Cruising Utopia. And amongst many beautiful ideas that he has in that book, one of them that really stuck with me was this idea that acts of queerness, queer performance, linger in space rather than disappearing after their action. And I think he says exactly, quote, serve as a conduit for knowing and feeling other people. And so I became really obsessed with this, with these two ideas, and what it would feel like to move through a world where we could sense the past, present, and emergent possibilities of queer and trans life as we moved through space. And so, because I'm trained as a web developer and a designer, primarily the tools that I first went to were web design and development. And so put together the first version of what is now Queering the Map, which at the point of its inception just held about 5 points of my own experience, but I was really interested in building an infrastructure for asking my community, both in Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, or Montreal, but also broader than that, how they were or had experienced queerness and transness in relationship to space. And so I put the site online in, I believe it was May of 2017. And since then it's grown beyond my wildest expectations. And there's now just over 400,000 submissions from across the world in 26 languages on the platform.
It's an incredible scale and collection, really. And I just feel so privileged to have been able to do some work around the platform over recent years with you. And it's incredible how you've managed to, I don't know, make it so sensible in a sensory, meaning. Those concepts of orientation and of this kind of lingering in space. It's an amazing way that those ideas live in the platform. I think not in a representative sense. I think there's something like really creative and generative in the way that you brought these into the design, and in the way that the platform seems to have this real liveliness, almost beyond you, or kind of beyond the affordances of kind of what you have built in for what the platform can and should be for. Okay, so let me ask you, lots of people, myself included, we would refer to you as the creator and the designer of Queering the Map. But something that has really kind of stuck with me is that you call yourself a custodian of the platform. So talk me through how you see your relationship with Queering the Map, and how has this kind of grown over time, and as the archive has grown in size so much?
Totally. I love the lead up to that question, and I love so much of the work that you've done in thinking sort of beyond how the platform is used outside of its affordances, as you said, is very much why ID myself as the steward or as the custodian of the platform rather than its designer or creator. And mostly that shift in language is about thinking of my role in the day-to-day. So rather than something that's fixed, I think at the time of its inception, I was the creator and I was the designer of querying the map. Those were the actions that I was primarily taking towards the platform. And I still do take those actions predominantly in an infrastructural and managerial role in terms of keeping the platform alive, paying the bills, doing the admin, moderating. But really, the designers of the platform now, I think, are more the people that are participating in and writing on and writing with the platform. Which, I mean, I also do that. I also use querying the map as a user as well as the person that's, making sure it doesn't fall apart from the inside out. But my day-to-day work and relationship to the platform is really thinking about how to keep it alive for as long as possible, how to make sure that the data is safe, that the stories that are pushed to the front end are safe. Again, that it's not going to collapse, which is really the responsibility that I feel like I hold. Yeah, so it echoes, I think that transition in the way that I think about my relationship to the platform really echoes the ethics of the platform itself, which is really thinking about queerness not as a fixed identity, but rather as something that emerges through relation. So relation to one another, relationship to infrastructures, social structures, etc. Which is one of the reasons why querying the map is anonymous, to move away from this sort of idea of single authorship or collecting sort of data around oneself to build some sort of discrete user profile. It's something that's much more leaky and it's much more collective and much more rooted in action. So it's not about using the platform is not necessarily about identifying oneself in every aspect of one's life as a queer person, as a trans person, etc. But really about this is an experience that unfolded. It unfolded in space, and that's enough to constitute a queer action as something that lingers over time, that has the potential to impact either the person that had that experience in terms of their recollection of that, the returning to those places, or in the context of querying the map, which is really about the circulation of these kinds of stories so that they might act on and move others. Yeah, that's one of the central tenets. So as I said, that shift in language is really about reflecting what my day-to-day labor is around the platform, rather than the sort of like it's cooler to say like I'm the creator, I'm the designer, which is true to a certain extent, but that's not as representative of not as representative of the day-to-day labor that I undertake around the platform.
Oh, nice. That's a really nice way to yeah, I guess, I know, be reflexive about the changing shape of the program, and yeah, centering that kind of self-identification around the actual work involved. Nice. Okay, so what then? Let's talk about QT.bot then. So you've kind of developed QT.bot as this I don't know, I've heard you talk about it as like a crazy monster evil stepsister thing.
Yeah,
we'll get
exactly.
into why.
Yeah.
So on the actual process of developing QT.bot from querying the map, it's such an interesting line of flight that kind of I didn't expect, but I can the trajectory really resonates. So what motivated the development of the QT.bot project, creatively, conceptually, but also technically?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of different threads that wove together that brought me to start working on QT.bot. One, and I'll begin in the personal. Um, so QT.bot in many ways emerges from a feeling of overwhelm from the process of the relationship of moderating and stewarding all of the hundreds of thousands of stories that have come into querying the map. And I often talk about it that inside of the file folder system, inside of my mind that houses all things querying the map, the database is this corrupt .zip file because of the amount of data, the amount of feeling in the form of data, in the form of text that lives there that I cannot physically compute or metabolize. And so it exists in this very much like, very much like navigating the front end of querying the map, or, scrolling at 10 times the speed down a Twitter feed and moving from, experiences of or stories of like hyper joy to hyper trauma and everything in between, but all at once very, very quickly. And because of the deep level of earnesty and vulnerability of the platform, that creates this intense sense of overwhelm in living with it and stewarding it for the past 5 years now. QT.bot emerged, and the kinds of stories that QT.bot creates, which if you haven't seen any outputs from the project, they don't make a lot of sense, and they simultaneously make an enormous amount of sense on a sort of primarily on an affective level, rather than perhaps a totally logical one. And so when I started exploring the use of machine learning in relationship to QT.bot, I was really struck by the resemblance between how I understood or could store querying the map's affective world, and how QT.bot was producing in a similarly dissociative manner, which then leads me to on a technical or thinking with why artificial intelligence in relationship to querying the map. As the project grew and as more research in an academic context was done around it, and as people were sort of starting to make claims about, okay, this is what this project is and this is what it says, I felt like I felt this sort of anxiety around the academic and my own academic sort of propulsion to try to make sense of things when querying the map as a platform was really set up to open a question and invite as many answers to it as possible. So to multiply rather than to I always forget this word, and I say this all the time. Deductive rather than to deduce, rather than to take all this data and say, okay, these are things that are true. Machine learning and the possibility to sort of create, working with this data set to create even more versions of queer and trans storytelling, felt like it was continuing the mission of querying the map, of engaging in the potentials of certain levels of opacity in terms of queer and trans storytelling, not giving everything away, not trying to make sense, especially given the context of the history and presence of queer and trans life and queer and trans archives, that queerness and transness are often framed in relationship to the unreal. So queerness as a phase, transness as something that is not real as an embodied experience. And so there felt like there were a lot of resonances in terms of how culturally we understand artificial intelligence, which of course is neither artificial nor intelligent, as the title of this series leads us towards, really importantly. So there felt like it felt like it was very there was a simpatico between sort of ways of thinking about queer and trans life and ways of thinking about artificial intelligence as in their relationship to the quality of realness or truth, that felt really exciting as a starting point to work from. And then sort of circling back as I began to explore machine learning tools in relationship to the database, I was like, okay, wow, this is one of the first projects that I've done that feels like it is, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. A friend of mine said this to me once and it really resonated. I do think that it's true that it's perhaps more it's particularly autobiographical in relationship to how I experience querying the map. And so I was really invigorated by it personally, but also in terms of the kind of conceptual questions that I could think through with QT.bot as a project to start with, which has sort of historically been my process, is having a set of ideas and then building a that often emerge from queer, trans, decolonial, feminist, Black theory, and then are sort of crystallized as a process inside of a project like Querying the Map or like QT.bot, and then writing and speaking and thinking with and furthering the development of those projects as sort of like a research in motion, like exactly this kind of talk and thinking with you and doing research with you. Yeah, so those are those two pieces. And then on a technical level, which I think you mentioned at the beginning, but QT.bot is an implementation of the base framework of GPT-2, which is a machine learning model developed by Open AI. And it's trained obviously on the textual database of Querying the Map. And then there's a separate database of the scraped Google Maps Street View imagery that correspond to the points on Querying the Map, that is used to generate imagery for this agent that dreams queer and trans parallel temporalities.
It's such an exciting way of not using, but like creatively experimenting with this amazing archive of data that you have, especially as you said, that is so much more than like this thing happened to me as like a truth, and of like, look at all of these shared experiences that we are having as a collective affect. Okay, well, let's kind of move forward in the process then of the project. Talk us through how you are creatively experimenting with QT.bot now. How are you working with QT.bot?
Totally. So jumping back to the beginning of my answer to the first question, or sorry, to the previous question, I have been really interested in terms of the relationship between artificial intelligence and its relationship to realness or truth, and queer and trans life, and the historical and contemporaneous relationship to truth and realness. As I began experimenting with various machine learning models for text generation particularly, what excited me the most were the stories that failed. The stories, which is to say the stories where it was very clear that this was written by a machine and not taken from Querying the Map. Whereas the ones that this machine learning model output that could quote unquote pass as being written by a human did not particularly interest me. For many reasons, one of which is that is, I mean, that's the sort of commercial purpose of these kinds of machine learning models, so Chat GPT being a great example of that, the reason why it's causing so much controversy, let's say, or one of the reasons why it's so exciting, whether that excitement is positively or negatively valenced, is because of its ability to, let's say, fool the reader, or to get as close as possible to being indistinguishable from human written text. And so that felt like an exciting place in terms of intervening and thinking about queer and trans histories and relationships to theory around failure, as something that's really generative, rather than trying to use this project to just make more stories that could potentially populate the world of Queering the Map, the website. And I think because of so there's that sort of relationship to the text, and there's also this, the way that dominant text generation models work in terms of synthesizing huge amounts of text from the internet, to create this sort of super voice that is very individualized, whereas Querying the Map is very clear. I mean, obviously the internet is many, many voices speaking at once. And I was interested in these sort of aesthetics of failure with QT.bot, that working poorly or working queerly with machine learning models, both text and image generation models, could create this sense of discordance of multiple people speaking at once, and making it very clear that this is a data set that cannot be collapsed into a singular voice. QT.bot as an agent is a very fractured, dissociative, schizoanalytic agent that is always more than one. And I've been sort of continuing to try to explore that particular importance in the project aesthetically, of not trying to frame, or not allowing QT.bot to be framed as an individual, but rather the sort of broken collectivity. And then on the very like fast and dry way that I work with QT.bot is it's at the moment it's two separate an image generation model or video generation model and a text generation model. And it spits out an innumerable pieces of content. And then I'm Querying the Map steward. I've referred to previously Querying the Map as my daddy, and I'm QT.bot's mother. And so I'm sort of keeping him on the rails, by selecting the stories that I feel like explore the kinds of questions that I'm trying to explore with QT.bot from this innumerable set of possibilities that working with these models can produce.
Oh, amazing. You're phrasing thinking about the aesthetics of failure has my brain like pinging all over. I'll have to continue this conversation for another few hours, I think. Well, okay, let's talk about the outputs that are coming out of the process and the project. What was your experience like of first translating QT.bot into the exhibition that you're involved in, and into the video that we linked to in the information about today's session? And what was it about was there anything about the materiality of those outputs that has kind of then informed your further creative practice and process with QT.bot?
Definitely. I think perhaps the primary learning in relation to working with QT.bot really as a process at the beginning, and a question, and then turning it into quote unquote, or I guess not quote, like artworks.
Yeah.
Was thinking about or framing QT.bot as this agent that was creating, one of the ways that I was thinking about specifically the video, but also the images, was QT.bot was creating sort of like nature documentaries about this world that lay sort of in the rubble or in the aftermath of querying the map, or that lay sort of in the parallel, if we like, you know, squint and tilt our heads a little bit, and if that's how we would get to this other way of thinking and feeling through the database that is querying the map. And so the aesthetics of documentary became really central, and have remained really central as I've continued to work on the project, thinking about subtitling also, which the video is subtitled, but as are the image outputs of QT.bot. If you've not seen them, are images that are generated by a StyleGAN, and then like yellow subtitled text that's been elevated in its importance by being placed in the center of the images. And so was thinking a lot about filmmaking processes, processes of documentation when there's a level of misunderstanding in relationship to how something is being translated. So when we watch a film in a language that we don't understand and we put subtitles on, there's a very different relationship to the absorption of an image when it's being mediated through text, because we can't understand necessarily the audio or the image as much as we might otherwise. And so that those sorts of aesthetics of misrepresentation or misunderstanding or half understanding are what really are things that came through the opportunity in 2019 was when I did a residency with ADA-X, which is a feminist media studio in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal. Yeah, where I had the opportunity to translate and think about, okay, what does this world look like aesthetically? And those sorts of questions have continued in terms of the work that I'm doing now around the platform, or around, sorry, the project, which I'm now working on developing an interactive platform so that people can interact with QT.bot outside of me selecting and mommying everything that QT.bot does.
Well, that leads me perfectly into my next question. But first, I just wanted to say, like, it's thinking about this as documentation is, yeah, it's so interesting, especially because the images that are produced, say in the video, for example, are so there's such a sense of unreality to them, or, you know, you really center this sense of like fiction and fabulation that totally carries through in the even the choice of the yellow for the words that are used, and the way that those like micro stories really play. I know you talked about how they really play with who is speaking in kind of having this multiplicity or polyvocality of voice. Something also super interesting that everybody should go and watch the video if you haven't is the way that they play with tense. Even even in the kind of title visual that you lead with, sitting here with you in the future, is just, it's so yeah, it's so like artistically exciting, I think, and such a great example of using these technologies as something to think with, rather, and in really kind of creative and generative and like politically engaged ways, rather than just being something that we might like theorize or respond to, which, you know, as you said, you kind of try and lean away from those just sense-making practices that are, you know, our kind of default mode of working in the academy. Yeah, anyway, I'll just have a short rave about how much I love the project.
Thank you.
Let me come to then why this kind of technology, which I think feeds into a bit what you're hoping it to exist as, in a way that other people can interact with it. why AI, neural networks, machine learning? What is it about these kinds of emerging technologies that really draws your interest as something for you, but also a broader queer community to work with and to queer?
Totally. So I sort of started, like one of my investments is this thinking about, okay, what are the existing sort of cultural relationships between these two, between artificial intelligence and queer and trans life? And also a side note, if you haven't seen the video, I probably actually one of the primary inspirations for this project is there's a video, a conversation between Sophie the robot, or sorry, Sophia the robot and Sophie, the late incredible, unbelievable musician and inventress of hyperpop, which is from Dazed, which I would really recommend because watching this video is like the overlap between, yeah, queer trans life and artificial intelligence is just, there's just so much there aesthetically and conceptually. So that's one piece. The other piece is that it's topical, it's emergent, it's happening now. And as someone that works with data, and particularly data produced by and for marginalized communities, engaging in how artificial intelligence is being used from artistic to corporate to state contexts feels really urgent. Um, and so posing these kinds of questions through the mediums that I know how to work with as a starting point um, uh, feels to a certain extent like a responsibility. Um, and part of that responsibility, which is part of my reasoning for trying to further the project into something that, like querying the map, is interactive and interacted with the community for whom it's by and for, is using it as a pedagogical tool to think about questions around broadly artificial intelligence and machine learning in relationship to how we live our day-to-day lives. Questions around the pros and cons of the inclusion of particular kinds of data sets within machine learning projects. So there's an easy line of thought that says, okay, machine learning models, artificial intelligence are incorporating bias along racist, transphobic, xenophobic, etc. Lines. So the answer is, well, let's just include more data about those kinds of people, or by those kinds of people. And I think that's not necessarily the immediate response that I think that we should have, because the questions that we need to pose are more on the level of infrastructure rather than inclusion, just the inclusion of data. And so QT.bot is sort of beginning to, and I'm working to deepen my technical knowledge and to be able to really build and think about the infrastructure of these machine learning models from queer and trans perspectives, because simply including data into these kinds of systems is, I don't think that's the correct answer. I think that we have to intervene on a much deeper structural or infrastructural level. And so that really animates the sense of urgency or responsibility that I feel around working on this project, but also in the same way, and I really appreciate what you said about querying the map at the beginning of this talk in terms of how it, let's say, like distills and then reanimates theory, in this case, like from Sarah Ahmed and Jose Esteban Munoz, rather than, rather than just through writing, but through an infrastructure, so that they become something that can be inhabitable as a thought that's maybe a little bit less explicit than theory might be. I think that's really my aim going forward with this project and building this kind of infrastructure that can invite people into these kinds of questions as they pertain to their daily lived experience, in a way that's perhaps more accessible than than writing a paper about it, which I also love to do. But it's one, it's a different modality. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think that like that resonance totally can be seen around how querying the map has been taken up. I mean, even just the people that kind of we've spoken to totally end up drawing on the same language and ideas from these, you know, rather dense conceptual works. With no academic background, so no, you know, no kind of real desire to engage with the queer experience on that academic scholarly level. So, you know, they're like normal people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That haven't
like
been ruined by academia. I mean, I'm gratefully ruined. I've been ruined. I mean, I would be no one without Sarah Ahmed, Jose Esteban Munoz, Lauren Verlant.
Yeah, me
I'd be
too.
nothing.
Yeah. Well, before we open up to questions for everybody else, I'll just flag that I will in a little while. But I have one last major question for you, Lucas. So what are, you've spoken about some of the directions that QT.bot is growing in now, kind of specifically as something that we might be able to converse with, interact with, exist in something that's, yeah, and this is more kind of open, generative, engageable form. Are there any other kind of like resonant ideas starting to tick through for you? What kinds of maybe further resolutions of the project might we be able to expect? Where and what else do you maybe imagine at this point that these kind of creative artifacts might become?
Definitely. So I might have stolen my thunder a little bit on the answer of this question in terms of what's next, because really the focus, I actually just, in very exciting news on Friday, found out that I received a grant from the Canada Council to continue working on QT.bot, or
Amazing.
to build
Congrats.
QT.bot. Thank you. Yeah, to build QT.bot into a platform that people can interact with, because that's really the site that I feel like my aesthetic and pedagogical aims for the project will be most effectively worked through. I've been working QT.bot in a lot of ways is my first. I've been reticent to identify myself. I usually identify myself as like broadly as a designer and a researcher. Artist is like sometimes gets thrown in there, but I don't often use that word necessarily to describe myself. Though I'm definitely and QT.bot has been sort of like one of the first places where I've been creating work that exists in a gallery context, which is exciting. And I really enjoy that also, but it doesn't feel like it can have the same kind of impact as something like a web platform that invites participation, or some sort of designed object that's more about building an infrastructure rather than a final artifact. And so this movement towards making QT.bot into something that other people can have an experience with that is less dictated by my choices is really important. And so I'm going to spend the next year working on that. And then perhaps less as an artifact, or maybe an artifact in the form of writing that will inevitably inform the artistic and design-based outputs that I'm creating. A lot of my the writing that I've been doing for the past, I would say now almost a year, that's come out of QT.bot is thinking about the relationship between how machine learning models interpret and work with data, and how experiences of trauma and how we work with archives of experiences around things that cause us trauma work in similarly recursive logics in which we return and return and return to the scene of the crime or the archive of events that we have access to in order to tell ourselves a particular story about how things happened and how that affects us in the present. And one of the things in experiencing, I mean, in this case, a lot of my writing is around a particular experience, a depressive episode that was induced by a heartbreak, and a heartbreak that was quite shell-shocking in terms of how I imagined a future to unfold that then, in fact, did not. Is this the possibility of, and the sort of the way that QT.bot writes stories, which is very much about breaking text, breaking meaning, breaking, what's the word, breaking concurrence, how a series of events, how an archive of events is supposed to unfold into the future, has been extremely generative for me in terms of unlocking myself from the kinds of stories that I tell myself, about the world, that maybe need to be shattered to imagine something that comes from the cracks, from sort of telling the story wrong or telling the story differently. And so, yeah, I've been doing a lot of writing and research around that question again, what the overlap between how we experience and storytell around trauma and how machine learning models that are fed on a discrete database negotiate similarly by cycling through and trying to find different ways out. So yeah, there's a lot of writing that's come out of that that will exist in the universe of QT.bot.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's such a I mean, this kind of how we and why we might share and sit in and witness these traumas is also a huge part of querying the map. So it's yeah, it's great, even though it's terrible. It's great to hear how much that this is a part of the life of QT.bot as well, because I know that was something that always really resonated with me about the archive, is that you know, there's just such a diversity of stories that people have shared as a kind of marker of the queer experience that matters to them, and as queer experience, not necessarily something that's like performative to dominant heteronormative culture. Because, like, you know, like things like queering, things like coming out stories, you know, there's a few of them across the map, but they're almost outweighed in affect by these other kinds of experiences that are so many of them are joyful and funny and stupid. I mean, we were just talking about recently how there's like a whole Titanic fanfic happening on there.
Totally.
Yeah,
the best part.
Yeah, but such also a deep engagement with kind of trauma and with loss and with yeah, I suppose all of these like little failures that are still totally a part of yeah, queer experience in a very contemporary, but also in this kind of atemporal sense that the map really evocates. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear about all of these amazing things that you're working on. I will throw open to questions if there's anybody that has something pressing that they'd like to ask about, something about querying the map, something about AI, something about QT.bot, something about yeah, how we might technologically and creatively engage with queer life. You can jump on and just like say hello with you can raise your hand and turn your camera off and unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat and we can just read them directly there. Don't be shy. We can have the questions off the recording if you'd like to. While people are maybe thinking of how to articulate their questions, there are two other things that I don't have well-formed questions about, Lucas, but I will ask anyway because they're things that you've touched on. The first one was something I think is a really important provocation, especially for the work that we're doing in the Centre of Excellence, that having more experiences in the data is not enough. That there is some kind of much more deeper and infrastructural and important work that we need to do to almost rethink how we approach inclusivity. How do you kind of see that animating some of the other more general discussions that are happening at the moment in like public discourse in the media, especially as things like Chat GPT, having a firestorm at the moment. Do you see kind of these limited discussions of inclusivity featuring here? What kind of, I suppose, provokes your commitment to thinking that inclusive data is not enough?
I think, I mean, when I started the project, I remember when I started QT.bot, I remember reading about, I forget what year it was, but there's a Stanford researcher, his name is Mikhail Kosinski, who had created this facial recognition machine learning model that could, I think it was like 96% in the case of male coded people and 93% in the case of female coded people, could identify someone's sexual orientation based on facial recognition machine learning models, which is obviously bogus. And it was he wrote this paper and then it was disproved. And obviously, you know, it was the case of bias in terms of how all of the data sets are obviously, it's people that are looking at an image and saying that person's gay, that person's straight, and coding the images that way. So it's not a machine's intelligence that can incorporate this. And it also harks back to the, you know, horrible pseudoscience of phrenology. And so that, and then this researcher was contacted, and I don't know what but they were contacted by the Russian government about this system, which is extremely terrifying in terms of what the collection and datafication is the wrong word, but sort of the classification of data can do. That doesn't, in this case, it's maybe less a question of the technical infrastructure, but more the infrastructure or the sort of the possible uses of a data set that in that case obviously were not considered, or they were considered poorly, they were considered with malintent. And so I think, yeah, that's one sort of example of when inclusion goes very awry, because the particular needs, experiences, contexts of the groups of people who are having data willfully or unwillfully collected about them. I forget the specifics about this, but a couple of years ago, this person scraped a whole bunch of imagery from trans YouTubers talking about and documenting their transitions, their hormonal transitions particularly, and then and without their consent, and then left this data up for anyone to access. And so there's a number of examples, again, when the question of and I don't actually know the aim of that project specifically, but these questions of inclusion for inclusion's sake are really a band-aid that don't address the particularities of like, there's no such thing as a universal data set that will serve everyone equitably or ethically or meaningfully, because people's needs are different based on the context, based on the time. And so, yeah, these sorts of the questions of context, which machine learning is famously unable to understand, are so important. And just sort of throwing in quote unquote inclusive data sets or blocking a machine learning model from using particular kinds of words without understanding the context of those words. I mean, this is something that I've thought about a lot in the context of querying the map and moderating, where out of the box machine learning flagging systems are not really very effective in moderating content by and for marginalized people, specifically in the case of the reuse of language that can be used, obviously, like if, you know, if I call myself a faggot, like that's one thing, but if someone else, and so in a text context, it's very hard to understand the context. And so, yeah, there's an increased level of depth to the level of infrastructure and context that needs to happen, rather than just saying like, let's get more data about X marginalized community in the data set and then it'll all be good. I don't think that's going to work, and I think it's been shown that it's not going to work and that it's not the answer. Also, because you know that we don't always want to be, and we should not always want to be machine readable. There's many contexts in which, especially marginalized and overly policed life, it is not to our advantage to be legible in many ways, and so moderating that legibility is really important.
Oh, wow, that's a really great way of articulating lots of the real complexities, and yeah, I suppose even just like interrogating the motivations and the intent of even imagining applying technologies like this, and kind of for what purposes, to what ends. Yeah, it's a really important thing for us to think about, especially as, you know, with the center, we're trying to bring a critical lens and intervene in lots of these kinds of spaces. And also a really good point that you bring us back to, Lucas, which, you know, as we said earlier, motivates this series at all, is that like a lot of these classification systems is there's not some kind of perfect discrete machine out there that does this work, that this is people classifying other people. It is truly artificial intelligence. And I think that's a really kind of important provocation for us to carry forward, and to think with a little more deeply. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It has been so enriching. It's been so nice to have you come and talk for the centre, especially as it's World Pride. It's so nice to kind of have a concentrated conversation about queer and trans experience in this space, which is not something that we get a lot of focus of, you know, beyond these often more superficial conversations about marginalization. So I'm really glad to both have a critical conversation with you, but also learn more about the very generative, very creative ways you're working with these technologies to produce something that kind of is by and for queer communities, and not just commentaries on the applications of these technologies by corporations. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody who's joined us for the hour. As I said, the conversation will be recorded and put on the centre's YouTube. The only other thing, I suppose, is to say very, very happy World Pride to everybody, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ash, for having me. This was really, really a joy. And thank you also, everyone, for joining.